That morning, standing in my own wedding dress, I watched my father, the man who raised me with his hands cracked from years of work, be mistaken for the maintenance staff. They laughed. My fiancé didn't defend him. My future mother-in-law whispered something that made the guests chuckle. And in that moment, I realized the quiet I'd chosen all my life had only taught them I could be humiliated without consequence. My father didn't say a word. He just lowered his eyes, the same eyes that once looked straight into gunfire and never flinched. Something broke inside me then. Not loud, not visible, but final. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply made a promise, one they'll remember long after the music from that wedding stops playing. I once believed nothing could ruin a wedding held above the clouds, wrapped in Colorado snow. But that morning, one look, sharp, polished, and cruel, was all it took to tear everything apart. The air inside the bridal suite felt too perfect, too staged, as if the entire day had been rehearsed for photographs instead of a life. Downstairs, guests murmured, crystal chandeliers glittered, and every detail gleamed with money and precision. Somewhere between the white orchids and the scent of champagne, I started to feel like an accessory, not a bride. They said my father would be late. He didn't drive mountain roads, and he refused the offer of a chauffeur from Gavin's family. "I've got legs," he'd said over the phone, "and a bus ticket works just fine." When the music began, I steadied my breathing. Gavin waited at the altar, smiling like this was a business merger he'd already won. Then the side door opened. A gust of cold air swept through the room, and my father stepped in, vest frayed, shoes dusted with snow, holding a small gift wrapped in newspaper. The room froze. Then laughter rippled. A waiter hurried toward him, asking what needed fixing. My stomach twisted as Vivian, Gavin's mother, covered her nose and muttered something that made people laugh louder. My father's shoulders straightened, then lowered. For the first time in my life, he looked smaller than the world around him. Gavin's fingers dug into my wrist. "Don't make a scene. Gia!" "He's embarrassing everyone." Something inside me went very still. I slipped free, stepped off the aisle, and walked barefoot across the polished floor. The piano kept playing. The crowd parted like glass breaking. I reached my father, placed a hand on his arm, and simply said, "We're going home." He tried to protest, voice trembling. "But your wedding." "It ended the moment they laughed at you." We walked past them, past silk dresses, champagne flutes, and 100 stunned faces, out into the snow. Behind us, the music kept playing for a ceremony that no longer existed. My train dragged across the ice, leaving a crooked white line behind us, the last trace of a life I'd outgrown without realizing it. We drove down the mountain without a word. The old Ford Ranger rattled as the road curved through the snow, every bump echoing through the silence. There was no music, no apology, no tears, just the sound of the wind and my father's steady breathing beside me. The kind of breathing that came from someone who'd seen enough wars to know which ones were worth fighting. He didn't look at me. His hands rested on his knees, rough and still stained from years of work. When I finally pulled over at a small rest stop halfway down the ridge, he said quietly, almost like he was speaking to the mountains instead of me, "Don't be sorry, Gia. This isn't shame. This is clarity. Now you know who you were about to marry." I wanted to ask why he came, why he'd put himself through all that humiliation, but the words stayed caught in my throat. He turned toward the snowy peaks, the fading light catching in his gray eyes. "I didn't come for them," he said softly. "I came because you still deserve someone who stands when everyone else bows." That night, I stayed at his cabin. It was small and worn, smelling faintly of oil and pine. Old photographs hung crooked on the wall. My father in uniform, standing beside men who were probably gone now. I'd always thought he'd buried that part of his life long ago. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of metal scraping. My father sat in front of the fire, polishing a weathered leather notebook. The cover was scarred, the edges curling from time. When I asked what it was, he just smiled, the firelight glinting off his glasses. Something I swore I'd never open again. He flipped it open. Inside were blueprints, dense lines and notes stamped with U.S. Department of Defense markings. At the very bottom of the stack was a yellowed document. Project Aurora, Structural Engineering Lead, Salvatore Russo. My breath caught. You worked on Aurora? He nodded once, a slow, resigned motion. Back in the 80s, they stole it, sold it off to private contractors. I walked away before it killed me. The pages trembled in my hands as I turned them. Who stole it? Dad? He hesitated before answering, his voice dropping to a growl. A company called Ellery Infrastructure. I froze, feeling the air leave my chest. The same name, the same family. By morning, the storm had eased. Melted snow dripped from the roof in slow, steady beats. My father and I sat at the kitchen table, the old notebook between us. The fire had gone out, but the smell of burnt wood lingered, heavy as truth. Under one of the back pages, I noticed a layer of glued paper curling at the edges. I peeled it back carefully and found a faded property map. A network of shell companies, all incorporated in Delaware. Every one of them led to the same parent name, Ellery Infrastructure Holdings. My stomach turned. The people who mocked my father yesterday had built their empire on his stolen designs. At the very end of the notebook, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a single line. For the ones who never came home. I stared at it for a long time. Then I asked, why didn't you ever fight them? He sighed, eyes fixed on the dying fire. I didn't want you growing up rich and cruel. I wanted you to earn what they couldn't buy. Grit. His voice cracked on that last word, and the room fell silent except for the old clock ticking on the wall. In that moment, I understood that my father's entire life had been a quiet act of endurance, his dignity carried in silence because no one had cared to listen. I stood, staring at him, the man who built bridges no one ever thanked him for, who was treated like a ghost in the very country he helped hold together. They laughed at the wrong man, Dad. For the first time in years, his eyes caught light again. Gia, what are you planning? I closed the notebook, the metal clasp snapping shut with a sound that cut through the room like a loaded chamber. Something you should have done 30 years ago. Outside, the last of the snow fell from the roof and shattered against the frozen ground. Quiet, but final. I never thought I'd see another military gate again. After leaving the Air Force 3 years earlier, I promised myself I was done with concrete walls, steel corridors, and men who measured worth by rank. But finding out the truth about Project Aurora changed that. If I wanted justice for my father, I had to go back inside the system that betrayed him. I applied for a position at the Defense Infrastructure Review Unit, the government branch that oversees private military contracts. My file was still clean, my reputation intact. Within a week, they hired me as a temporary technical advisor. The first morning back, the smell of metal and jet fuel hit me like déjà vu. I walked through the same gate where I once saluted superiors. Only now I was here to uncover the people who'd stolen from my bloodline. I searched the internal archives, scrolling through project names, Aspen Shield, Blue Peak Defense, Frontline Housing. Each carried the same signature, Ellery Infrastructure. Opening the blueprints made my chest tighten. The layouts were identical to my father's work from Aurora. Every bolt, every load-bearing joint. His fingerprints were buried beneath new logos and million-dollar contracts. I needed backup. I reached out to Cole Grayson, an old comrade my father once saved in Panama. He met me at a diner, his voice low and steady. If someone stole Sal's work, they picked the wrong daughter to mess with. We divided tasks. I'd trace government data. He'd dig into Ellery's suppliers. Within days, Cole sent me photos. Military-grade steel crates, relabeled as civilian materials. It was fraud on a federal scale. Later, another file came through. The Ellery Veterans Foundation, a charity that was supposed to help wounded soldiers. Most of the funds led to shell companies under Vivian Ellery's name. I stared at the glowing spreadsheet, bile rising in my throat. They used veterans' names to steal government money. Cole asked what came next. I closed my laptop and said, "We go deeper. But first, I'm facing someone who owes me the truth." I met Gavin at his Denver office, 40 floors above the city, glass, chrome, and lies. He smiled politely, pretending the wedding never happened. The model of Aspen Shield sat on his desk, a near-perfect copy of my father's design. When I asked about Aurora, he laughed it off. "It's business. Gia, your dad signed it away decades ago." I felt something cold and clean settle inside me. Then he slid an envelope across the table. 5% equity, a Chicago penthouse, and lifelong silence. I looked him in the eye. "You're offering to buy my silence with what you stole." He leaned back, smug. "That's not theft, it's acquisition." I pressed stop on the recorder in my pocket. "Then you just acquired your own downfall." Outside, snow began to fall, slow, heavy, inevitable. The kind that buries everything rotten until the thaw reveals what's left standing. We called it Operation Snowfall because every truth buried under layers of ice eventually thaws. The colder it was, the sharper it would cut once unearthed. Cole and I began quietly, pulling together a handful of former Air Force engineers now working as civilians. Old friends, men who owed my father more than they could ever repay. We met in the small workshop behind my father's garage, a place that smelled like rust, oil, and long-kept secrets. Each night, under the weak yellow light of a single lamp, we worked. A massive map covered the table, its surface crowded with red pins and hand-scribbled names. Aspen Shield, Blue Ridge, Copper Canyon, 3 different projects, all identical in structure, all born from Aurora, my father's creation, stolen and renamed. The data wasn't enough. I needed something tangible. Cole found a lead, a restricted storage facility just outside Aspen. "If the Aurora rebuild exists," he said, "that's where they're keeping the parts." We drove through the night, the mountain roads slick with black ice. The wind screamed across the ridges as snow thickened, swallowing the headlights. By the time we reached the gate, my hands were numb. Faded government warnings hung crooked on the fence. Restricted property, federal use only. We waited until the last guard light went dark. Cole hacked the lock using an old military codebreaker, and the steel doors groaned open, echoing into the cold. Inside, rows of towering wooden crates stood like tombstones. Each was stamped with the words, "Aurora 2. I opened one, and the sight made my knees weak. Prototype sensor arrays, composite blast-resistant materials, blueprints sealed in plastic. My father's handwriting marked every corner. We photographed everything and uploaded the data to a secure channel. Then I noticed a smaller crate tucked beneath the rest. Inside, a shipment manifest carried Vivian Ellery's signature. She had personally authorized the transfer of classified materials from government stockpiles to private development. Cole's jaw tightened. She used the veteran charity funds to pay for this. I pulled up the donation registry and cross-referenced the names. My stomach twisted. Half the listed veterans had been dead for over a decade. "They stole from the dead," I whispered. "From the people my father built bridges for." We packed up and left before the next patrol. Snow hammered the windshield, a wall of white and fury. Cole glanced over, voice low. "You realize what happens if they find out it's you?" I gripped the steering wheel. "Then they'll finally meet a Russo who fights back. Word travels fast when it's not supposed to." 3 days later, I got a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or someone gets buried." My phone froze that night. The laptop followed, locked, encrypted from a remote source. Whoever they were, they knew exactly where to strike. Cole called immediately. "You're in their crosshairs now. I didn't care about myself. I called my father. No answer. Another ring. Then a third. On the 4th, a stranger's voice came through. "Your father's been in an accident." By the time I reached the hospital, the world had narrowed to fluorescent light and antiseptic. My father lay still beneath a white sheet, his face bruised, neck in a brace, breath shallow. The doctor said he'd been hit from behind. Driver fled the scene. I held his hand, whispering that I'd find who did this. His eyelids flickered. Promise me, Gia. Justice, not revenge. He drifted back into sleep, leaving those words to hang like a weight on my chest. I picked up his jacket from the chair and felt something hard inside the pocket, a small GPS tracker. I handed it to Cole when he arrived. He turned it over, frowning. This model's used by private security, Ellery's contractors. The truth hit me like a blow. They'd been following him, maybe me, since Aspen. I stood there, staring at my father's bandaged hand. They wanted a war. I whispered, I'll give them one, by the book. That night, Cole and I duplicated all the evidence and sent it to a military attorney in Deep Sea for safekeeping. A few hours later, an anonymous email landed in my inbox. They know about Operation Snowfall. Gavin's talking to the board tomorrow. I didn't need to read between the lines. They were going to frame my father. Outside the hospital window, smoke rose from the mills across the valley, blending into the falling snow, gray swallowing white, truth drowning in silence. My reflection stared back from the glass. Not a bride anymore, not a daughter in mourning, but a soldier back on duty. If they want smoke, I said to the mountains beyond the window, I'll show them the fire. 3 weeks after my father's attack, I stood on the Capitol steps in Washington, the winter wind catching the edge of my old uniform coat. It had been years since I'd worn it, yet that morning it felt right, not ceremonial, necessary. Inside, every seat was filled, cameras flashed, lawmakers whispered behind folders. Across the room sat Richard and Gavin Ellery, polished and composed, their confidence thick enough to taste. Gavin looked at me with the same faint smile I once mistook for love. Now it felt like poison. When my name was called, I stepped to the witness stand and spoke steadily. My name is Gianna Russo. I'm here to testify that Ellery Infrastructure used classified defense blueprints, stolen from Project Aurora, designed by my father, Salvatore Russo. The room stirred. Richard objected, claiming there was no proof. I opened the file. The screen behind me lit up. My father's signature, S. Russo, glowing beneath the faded seal of the Department of Defense. Then, side by side, I showed Ellery's new design. It matched exactly. I pressed play on a recording. Gavin's voice echoed through the chamber. It's not theft, it's acquisition. Gasps filled the air. Cole presented the fraudulent veteran fund, names of the dead used to launder millions. Then a congressman rose, voice trembling. Mr. Russo, we owe you an apology. Everyone stood, uniforms, senators, civilians, saluting my father. For 30 years, they'd forgotten him. Not anymore. The story spread across America within hours. Every headline carried the same phrase, the Russo revelation. Justice, they said, had finally come for a soldier the world forgot. A week later, the FBI raided the Ellery estate in Aspen. Vivian was arrested in her living room, still wearing a white fur coat, the same style she'd worn at my wedding. Richard was pulled from his garage in handcuffs. Gavin tried to flee through Denver International, but didn't make it past security. The cameras caught every second. News outlets replayed the footage of me leaving the hearing beside my father, his worn suit, the old wheelchair, the quiet pride that no verdict could equal. For the first time, America saw the man they'd ignored for 30 years. 3 weeks later, the Pentagon held a special ceremony at the same resort where I once walked out in tears. No champagne, no orchestra, only the American flag, a military honor guard, and a silence heavy with redemption. When my father's name was called, he rose slowly, metal gleaming against his faded jacket. He leaned toward me and whispered, "You don't have to shout to be heard." I gripped his hand. "They mocked you here once, Dad. Now they're bowing." He smiled faintly. "No, Gia. They're just learning what respect looks like." After the ceremony, I announced the Russo Foundation for Veteran Innovators, a promise that no soldier's legacy would ever be stolen again. Spring arrived quietly, melting the last of the snow into streams that whispered through the mountains. I drove with my father back to Aspen, to the place where everything began, and finally ended. In the back seat sat a small urn holding my mother's ashes. She had waited for him her whole life. Now he said he wanted to take her home. We stopped on an old wooden bridge overlooking the valley. I opened the lid, and the ashes lifted gently into the breeze, swirling into sunlight before disappearing over the ridge. My father rested a trembling hand on my shoulder. "We finally built it right, Gia. And this time," I said softly, "they can't steal it." We sat there for a long time, listening to the stream and the first birds of the season. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out his old medal, the one he once called meaningless. "Keep it," he murmured. "It's not for what I did. It's for what you became." I held it tight as the sun caught the medal, casting a golden shimmer across the water. The final image: two figures sitting by the stream, a small American flag fluttering beside them, its colors mirrored in the current. Not every soldier carries a weapon. Some carry dignity and a daughter brave enough to defend it.